Hey, this is Brett. You're watching Bread and Some Books. Today we're continuing Boxcar Bertha, an autobiography, and this is Chapter 7. Ina and I took a room in Greenwich Village. I wasn't interested in anything except looking around, but Ina hunted a job and got one as a maid for a young woman in a small apartment on Washington Square, and I loafed around the village. But a week was all I could stand. Malatini was on my mind. I determined to follow him, even if he did not want me. I had a little money left, and I took a bus to Trenton, where I caught a freight to Chicago. Except for being scolded by a fussy brakeman at Buffalo and having an uneventful night in a hobo camp at Erie, nothing happened until I reached Cleveland. I had heard the yards were tough there, so I got out of the empty boxcar in a hurry and made off between the rows of cars. About 50 feet down the tracks, a rough-looking dick stopped me. "Where are you going?" he asked. "I'm going home," I answered. "Now, don't lie to me," he growled. "Where do you live? You know damn well you can't come in on a freight. I'm going to lock you up." He took hold of my arm and led me over to a little section hand's shanty and shut the door behind us. "If I took you over to the police station, they'd give you 60 days, he said. "If you're nice to me, I'll let you go and give you a little change besides." His face was ugly. He was used to getting what he wanted. I had a vision of all the girls on the road running into him and being taken into the same shanty before they could get through Cleveland. I saw red, and I hauled off and slapped him across the face. "Give me the 60 days, I said. His face was ugly and red with fury as he reached for a phone and called a patrol wagon. Then he sat and glowered at me while we waited. If looks could kill, we would have both died in that shanty. They took me off to the station, and the next morning I came up before Judge Dan Cole. "Have you an attorney?" he asked me. "No." Then a young lawyer, Martin Eisler, stepped forward and said, "Your Honor, I'll defend this young lady." The clerk handed me a Bible. "I don't want to swear on the Bible," I told him. "Why not?" asked the judge. "Why not?" I repeated after him vaguely. I wasn't sure, but the Bible put into my hands at that moment made me angry. Words of my free thought friends came to me, and I used them. Because the Bible is a pack of lies? Because it's a lot of bunk to keep the minds of the workers in bondage? The judge scowled down at me. "Go on with the case," he said to the lawyers. Two railroad dicks swore they had seen me get out of a loaded car of merchandise, and it was quite evident that I had broken the seal of the car to enter. They also said that I had cursed them and used vile language in resisting arrest, and that I had tried to slug them. Mr. Eisler said what he could for me, but it was no use. "Bertha Thompson, I sentence you to 60 days in the Warrensville workhouse. I want to give you plenty of time to read your Bible." A big bus took 7 of us from the Cleveland County Jail to Warrensville House of Correction, where all our clothes were taken from us, and we were sent to the regulation shower. When we left the shower room, we had to walk a distance of perhaps 10 feet, stark naked, with our arms raised high, hands wide open and mouths open too, in full view of the matron. Every orifice of the body and the spaces in between the toes and the hair were examined, to be sure that no dope was being brought in. In the dressing room, we were given our own shoes and stockings and underclothing and clean uniforms. Too late for the regular supper, 7 of us, they called fresh fish, were given a meal. Then we were shown our beds in the dormitory and taken to the prison yard, where we were allowed to spend 2 hours before bedtime. I looked over my fellow prisoners. No one seemed downcast. The girls were gossiping and laughing. The older women, and fully a third seemed to be over 50, were sitting quietly on benches talking. Nearly half of the prisoners were colored. Big Mamie, a husky Irish woman, greeted me with a smile. "Welcome to our hotel. What are you in for?" "Judge said it was vagrancy," I answered, "but my guess is that it was for not handling a man right." What are most of these women in for? She shrugged. Oh, booze, jazz, stealing. Some of them are dopes. Franklin Jordan's statement, all women's actions are motivated by the desire for pleasure and power and profit, popped into my mind. Who's the mopey-looking one there? I indicated a sad-eyed girl who stood pressing her hands together in front of her and mumbling, "Oh, that's some of the Jane the Bulls picked up on the street saying, he murdered me with his love. I think she's nuts, but the judge didn't think so, and he gave her 30 days out here to quiet down. But instead of that, she's bawling all night. He murdered me with his love. That bunch of women over there on that bench are dope fiends." She indicated a haggard-looking group. "They make it hard for everybody," she continued. "If they ask you to help them make a connection, don't have anything to do with them. If they want you to let somebody write a letter for them, say no. A workhouse would be a good place if it wasn't for the dope fiends. On account of them, you can't have nothing sent in, no food or clothes or anything that makes a little more pleasant. And say, sister, see those two girls there with the short hair?" She pointed out 2 girls with boyish bobs. "Keep away from them too. They're lady lovers, and if you don't look out, they'll try to make you." Big Mamie, I found out the next day, was my partner on the mangle in the laundry, where I was assigned to her work. Her weakness was booze. She had been in Warrensville 23 times, and 20 times she had been pinched by the same bull. She had some sort of a complex. Every night she got stewed in a joint called Cassidy's Saloon. She wanted to clean up the place. She finished her bit in the workhouse 2 days after I got there. My next partner on the mangle was a beautiful gray-eyed girl, Lucille. She was transferred that day from working in the Superintendent Burns' residence. She had not been in the laundry more than 20 minutes before the place was alive with buzzing. Being the maid in Superintendent Burns' house was the most coveted job around. There were good eats, and also comparative freedom. The talk was that this job could only be had by a fix from the outside. Some of the girls said that Lucille was kicked out because she was lazy. Others said she was using dope. But the older ones, looking at her nice figure, said the old lady Burns was jealous. All of us women slept in one room, a large dormitory with 6 beds, all on each side, and a large window between every 2 beds. The ceiling was high and the place was airy. I slept on the cot at the end of the row. Lucille was next to me. The aisle between the rows of beds was 15 feet wide. The space between the beds 3 feet. Lucille and I worked together for almost a week. She was not at all unfriendly or hostile, but she refused to talk about herself. I told her about my boxcar experience. I asked her questions. She shook her head good-naturedly with always the same smile. She seemed absorbed, and very quickly I learned it was better not to say anything to her. Her philosophy seemed to be, I've got 60 days to do. The less I say about it, the quicker it will pass by. And I accepted this also. Periodically, the officers of the jail searched the prison. This was known as the shake. Every prisoner was carefully searched. The bunks and lockers in which they kept their personal things next to their beds was also rummaged. The purpose of the shake was to discover whether the prisoners had any contraband objects, weapons, knives, saws, booze, dope, cigarettes, tobacco, matches, clothing stolen from the laundry, extra food. They were especially on the watch for articles with which the girls might have stolen from each other. Most of the prisoners did not fear the shake because they had nothing to conceal. It wasn't any special crime for one girl to swipe a lipstick from another, and it was no great offense to steal each other's underwear and handkerchiefs. But it was regarded as grand larceny to steal clothes from the matrons and the officers. I remembered one day the girls gave me a lovely brassiere. She said she had 2 of them. A few days later, one of the matrons found it on me and asked me where I got it. I quickly sensed that it was stolen, and I said that I had found it. Good-naturedly, she said she had been working here for 25 years, and she never found anything, and took the brassiere away from me. Sunday was general visiting day for all comers. Any other day, it was necessary to get a pass from the Director of Public Welfare or from the superintendent. No one came to see me. No one knew where I was, but Lucille had a number of special visitors. We only worked half a day on Saturday. Saturday afternoon before our time was up, Sadie, the runner, came into the dormitory and announced that Lucille had a visitor. She was out there with her visitor, Mr. Burns, with the 3 matrons and 2 guards, came in and ordered all of us to stand against the wall at the head of our beds. The shake was on. 1 matron and 1 male guard, together with 2 male trustees, carefully examined every bed. They took off the sheets and pillowcases and shook them thoroughly, and felt and punched each mattress. They watched for little rips or any new stitches. Often prisoners made little incisions in the mattresses, hid what they wanted, and sewed them up again. But the shake squad was on to nearly all their tricks. The lockers where the girls kept their combs, rouge, face powder, and trinkets were carefully fine-combed. They squeezed the toothpaste out of it. If it belonged to an apparent dope, every article of clothing was carefully examined, even the bulky seams opened. The general shake had been completed up to Lucille's bed when she returned from her visitor. She was startled. Immediately she turned and asked the matron if she could go to the toilet, but was refused. The window between our beds was open. I noticed that she was clutching something in one hand. She shifted about and finally put her hands behind her back. She attempted to throw whatever she had out the open window. She miscalculated, and the object hit the ledge of the window, bounced back, and fell on my bed near the pillow. The squad was working at the other end of the bed, but immediately picked up a rubber finger stall filled with heroin. Burns looked at me. "You big truck horse, you fooled us all the time you've been here." I felt myself blushing. I turned my gaze to Lucille, thinking that she would admit ownership, but her face was expressionless. They took me by the arm and sat me down in a chair in the middle of the room while they frisked Lucille's bed in person. Burns went to the telephone, and half an hour later 2 men came in, members of the Federal Narcotics Squad. Burns took me to his office. "Miss Thompson, these are 2 federal officers, and I want you to talk to them honestly and fearlessly. You're a good girl, we don't think you're a dope fiend, and if you tell the truth, we'll let you go. You have only a few days left here, and here's a chance for you to do something for your government. You love your country, you're a good citizen, and you can help us." But I said nothing. Then the federal man started. "Look here, kid, this is no joke. This is a federal offense. We found this stuff on your bed, and if you don't tell us the truth, we'll send you to the penitentiary for 5 years. If you don't want to go disgrace your mother and your folks, you'll tell us the truth. If you didn't put it there, you know who did. This broad Lucille doesn't mean you any good. She wouldn't give you a quarter to keep you from starving to death. Are you going to be a sucker and go down for 5 years for her? You know this Lucille is a dope fiend, and we know you've been holding her stuff for her." "I don't know anything about it," I said, and I repeated it 100 times. "I'm not a dope fiend. I've never used it in my life. I wouldn't know how." They coaxed me, they bribed me, they threatened me, shook their fists in my face, shouted at me, abused me. I became so infuriated, I finally slapped the matron in the face, and at that point 2 matrons and 3 guards dragged and carried me down to the basement and threw me in the hole, a horrible dark cell used for solitary confinement. I fell to the floor exhausted. It must have been hours later when the door opened and the guards threw someone else on the floor. The cell was pitch dark. I heard someone moaning and then heard Lucille's voice. "Are you in here, kid?" she asked. I crept over to her side and put my arms around her. She was in pain, sobbing bitterly. She said nothing, and I felt too miserable to say anything either, and we both sat there on the floor, our arms about each other, sobbing. After a while, we both went to sleep. I don't know how long we slept. I woke to find Lucille holding my head in her lap. "How do you feel?" she asked. "They told me you squawked on me, but I know you didn't. You're all right. You ought to be doing something better than riding in boxcars. You're not going to get yourself any money that way." "We do those things," I said. "It doesn't seem to matter. Why do you use dope?" She laughed harshly. "It's good for my asthma," she said, and then she became serious. "Junk never did anyone good, except peddlers, and if you're not convinced of this, now you will be in a couple of days when I start to kick my habit. Thank God we're both going to be out of this joint Friday morning." The next 2 days I had one of the most harrowing experiences of my whole life, watching a woman taking the cold turkey cure, or kicking a dope habit. Lucille did everything but die in that cell. First she was irritable and talkative. She walked up and down, and then she kicked and stamped and began to vomit. She complained about pains in her abdomen and muscles, and she begged me to rub her legs and arms, and she prayed and she cursed. We lost track of time, for it was always pitch dark there. Lucille became more and more noisy. After hours and hours, the guard and the matron, who had evidently been standing in front of the cell for some time, suddenly opened the door. "What's the matter? Too much heat in there, sister?" a guard asked. "For Christ's sake, send me a croaker," Lucille begged them. I'm dying." "You know how to get a doctor," they answered her. "You know how the federal officers are the only ones who can help you. Why don't you send for that doctor who came to see you Saturday? They grabbed him off and he's confessed everything." But between groans, Lucille managed to be defiant. "If he's confessed anything, he's lying," she said. The next 3 days dragged along. Lucille lay exhausted and limp, but no longer in pain. Then we tried to make plans. She told me a little about herself, but when she asked me where I was going, I told her that I wanted to go to Chicago and that I would go by freight. She said, "I never rode in a freight boxcar, but I bet I did something you never did. I beat my way out in the ladies' toilet and got a trip all the way from Omaha to Cedar Rapids, Iowa. I was flat in Omaha. Never mind why. I knew a traveling salesman who made his headquarters at a hotel in Cedar Rapids. I knew if I could get to him, he'd fix me up. I got the idea about the toilet from my way back when I was a child. My mother and I were in the toilet when the conductor came through, and he never came back to pick up our tickets. We turned them in after our trip and got our money back. I knew it was risky, but I was desperate and willing to try anything. I picked a day coach and followed along closely behind a bunch of college people taking packages on for a girl going away. Luck was with me. The toilet was unlocked, and I waited for over half an hour till the train got underway, and the conductor had come through, and then I sauntered out and sat down by the first man who eyed me. He had the little yellow ticket up between the windows, showing he had his ticket punched. It was night. After a while, everybody slumped down in their seats and took off their shoes like they do, and I showed the conductor opening the door to come into our car. So I snuggled down quick and put my head on this bird's shoulder. He had been trying to get his hand on my knee ever since I sat down, so he didn't throw me out. I asked her where she was going when she got out of the workhouse. "I'm going to Chicago, and I'll pay your fare." Suddenly, I was aware of my lack of clothing. I told her. "To hell with clothes," she answered me, "if they don't mean anything. You're all right with me, kid. If you were good enough to go to the hole for me, you're good enough to ride a Pullman with me. So Thursday afternoon, I was called out by the federal officers, and in their phraseology, I was given another last chance to save myself from 5 years if I would admit that I saw Lucille throw that dope on my bed. I don't know anything about it, I said. I don't use dope. I don't want to use dope. I don't know how it got there. I don't know anything about it. They tried to confuse me and threaten me. In the end, they told me they would be there in the morning to take me to the penitentiary, but they did not take us back to the hole. That night, Lucille and I slept on our own beds after we had been given baths and a good supper. Lucille was still unable to eat. She gave me her food, and I devoured it as well as my own. After breakfast, we were called and dressed out. I had 11 cents when I was arrested, and this was returned to me. Lucille signed a receipt for $65. We got on a streetcar, and when we had gone about a mile, Lucille saw a taxi. We hailed it and were driven to the Statler in Cleveland, where Lucille registered and received mail, which was waiting for her. We went to the room, and Lucille gave me money and sent me out for the daily paper and some oranges. When I came back, in about 15 minutes, I found her in finer spirits than I had ever seen her, and I knew she was full of junk, which she had received in her mail. All her woes and days of torture were over. She ordered a meal sent up to the room for us, and we ate and laughed and joked as if we hadn't a care in the world. We took the night train and arrived in Chicago the following morning at 8 o'clock and took a taxicab to Lucille's home. It was a modernist enough apartment house, but expensively furnished. Anna, Lucille's roommate, welcomed us. From another room came two sleepy-looking men, Jake and Jimmy. Jimmy was medium-sized with sallow complexion and dirty brown hair. Jake was very dark and looked like an Italian. Both had been lounging about in BVDs and trousers. They did not seem to mind newcomers. Anna gave me a dress and some of her underwear and drew a tub of water for me. I had just bathed and dressed when the bell rang, and they admitted a man who was introduced to me as Big Otto, and who I quickly learned had just been released from Bordeaux prison, Montreal, after having served a 2-year stretch. Later, I found it was for being a sneak thief, a heel as they called it. I was struck by the lack of enthusiasm and emotion. No one particularly excited about the fact that Big Otto and Lucille had just been released from jails. Everything was very matter-of-fact. Big Otto fascinated me from the beginning. He was tall and powerfully built, and very dark in complexion. In spite of his prison pallor, he looked straight at me with dead eyes and said, "How are you, big girl? You look good to me. Can we have a little drink together?" I looked well in Anna's dress and felt especially comfortable and snug in my girdle and brassiere. I brushed my hair back, and while Anna was helping me to dress, she had insisted that I rouge my lips and had penciled my eyebrows. I looked into the glass. I smiled in admiration of myself. We had a lively lunch. The conversation was purely business. Otto said the French-Canadian guards didn't like Americans, especially in jail. There had been a job in the bathroom, and quite a few of his old friends came in. No one expressed any sympathy or concern over him. They appeared somewhat bored if he spoke of anything in jail. Everybody in the room had been through the same thing. If not in Bordeaux, it was at Leeds Farm, Kansas City, or the Beanery of Chicago, Down Duck at Boston, or the Island at New York. The conversation quickly switched to the next spot they would grift. Otto announced that he had just run out of the Sheridan Plaza to deliver a message for Jimmy Doyle, whom he had just left in Montreal, and invited me to walk over there with him. When we came to near the hotel, he asked me to wait in the drugstore until he returned. He came back in about 15 minutes, and I asked him if he wouldn't like to walk over towards the lake with me. "Not today, kid. I got a little business." We stopped in front of a ladies' specialty shop, and he asked me to wait outside for a few minutes while he went in to see someone in there. When he came out, he stopped at the corner drugstore and had me wait outside again. When we got back to the apartment, he walked over to the table and from somewhere mysteriously brought forth 2 beautiful teddies, 6 pairs of hose, and a bottle of perfume, some face powder, and a jar of cold cream. "Here, kid, you may need these. If you don't like them, don't try to exchange them, 'cause the sale was final." For a moment, I didn't know what to say, and then I just looked at the things Otto had given me. I was pretty sure he had stolen them, and I didn't like it, but I hardly felt as though I was in a position to be his moral arbiter, so I thanked him briefly and let it go at that. "That's all right, kid," he said. "You just forget it, and I'll get you some handkerchiefs, and we can get your nose clean." That night, he came into my room after I'd gone to bed, and I was glad. He was a unique lover. He didn't say personal things to me. He avoided all tenderness. But when I woke up in the morning, his arms were around me. His cheeks were sallow and somewhat sunken. There was sorrow in his face. When I kissed him, he started, then opened his eyes slowly. "Is that you, gorgeous?" he asked gently. "Jesus, it's good to wake up and see wallpaper. I've been looking at bars and calcimine for 2 years. And that is the end of chapter 7. Thank you. Please like and subscribe.